Hello. So for my mini lecture, I wanted to focus on conditioning, specifically classical conditioning versus operant conditioning. In the textbook, only classical conditioning was covered in the chapters that we read for this week. So I wanted to expand that a little bit more to also encompass operant conditioning. So for classical conditioning, the experiment that I tie most closely to classical conditioning would be the Pavlov's dogs experiment. I did attach an image on the right side of the slide in which Pavlov is conducting one of his experiments on dogs. He did experiments on the digestive tract, different forms of digestion, and then salivation as well, but he is most known for his work in classical conditioning. So, for classical conditioning, this is an involuntary learned response. So, I attached an image on the right side of the slide. In the first picture, you can see a dog is salivating when he sees food. That is a natural biological response. So, that is unconditioned. That's going to happen regardless of what happens. But then in the upper right-hand corner of that image, there is a dog with a bell. Now, the bell doesn't elicit any sort of response in the dog because it is a neutral stimulus for the dog. There isn't anything that happens when that bell is rung. But when the dog is presented with the food and the salivation occurs, which is that unconditioned response that's just natural for the dog, and the bell is also rung, which is that neutral stimulus, um, they can get paired together if it is done enough times, and then the bell can become the conditioned stimulus. So once the bell is rung, the dog will salivate. So, to further explain the conditioned stimulus versus unconditioned stimulus, the conditioned stimulus is the stimulus that predicts the desired behavior. The unconditioned stimulus is the one that occurs when the conditioned stimulus is presented. So I did just explain Pavlov's dog experiment that he did in order to further understand classical conditioning, but there was also an experiment done before Pavlov's dog experiment by Edward B. Twitmeyer, in which he tested the knee-jerk reflex and classical conditioning in that aspect. So he had his subjects have their knee hit, they kicked their leg out, which is that natural knee-jerk reflex or response. And after a little bit of just hitting the knee, it was then paired with a bell, or they would have to say ah or something like that. But there was a neutral stimulus that was introduced. Once that was paired with the knee jerk reflex in which their knee was being hit, sometimes it would just be that neutral stimulus that had become the conditioned stimulus. That bell would ring and they would kick their leg out. They would have that knee jerk reflex, regardless of if they were hit with the little hammer to the knee or not. So, to further talk about classical conditioning, the little Albert experiment is also an example of this. This was done by John B. Watson in 1920. It consisted of a little boy, little Alfred. He was exposed to animals. He was very curious, excited to interact with the animals, but then there was a neutral stimulus introduced. It was when there would be a loud noise behind his head. Um, it would be a loud bang, and that scared him, so he connected that fear to seeing those little animals. Um, so he became afraid of these animals, specifically a little white rat and other small little animal creatures. But that conditioned response beginning to form would be the acquisition period for the little Albert experiment. There is also an extinction period in which the conditioned response begins to disappear. The unconditioned stimulus is no longer paired with the conditioned stimulus. So this may happen if they don't have the situation in which they're put through. Maybe Alfred has like a different experience with animals in which he can find them delightful and he doesn't have that fear response. But unfortunately, Watson did not forcefully create this extinction period, so it is unknown if there ever was an extinction period for little Albert, excuse me. Um, but it is known that the child that was used in this experiment did pass away at the age of 6. So again, limited information on this experiment. But after the extinction period, there can also be a period of spontaneous recovery, in which the learned responses may suddenly reappear after the initial extinction. Um, After the spontaneous recovery, extinction can't occur once again, but the spontaneous recovery would just be a resurfacing of that conditioned response. Then generalization is the last term on this slide, and that means that the response is elicited by other similar stimuli. So for that little white rat that little Albert saw, maybe he saw a white bear or a white rabbit, he would still have that fear response even if he was conditioned to have that response just for that white rabbit because he generalizes the fuzzy nature of the creature and then also the color of the creature, and it reminds him. So moving on to operant conditioning. So this connects closely with Skinner's rat theory. B.F. Skinner was the one to really highlight this phenomenon. So there is a little image of a rat holding a sign that says "Will press lever for food," which connects directly with B.F. Skinner's rat experiment. So, operant conditioning differs from classical conditioning because it is a voluntary learned response. So, in operant conditioning, consequences and outcomes of a situation influence a subject's behavior. So, there is reinforcement and punishment. So, reinforcement, you want to increase the behavior that you're seeing, and punishment, you want to decrease that behavior. So, for the Skinner's box experiment, the rats were placed into the box. They would bump against the lever, and then there would be food released in some of the experimental conditions. This is an example of positive reinforcement. The rat pushes the lever, that's the desired behavior, and then the reward is the food. So then the rat would learn through operant conditioning, oh, if I press this lever, then I will get the food that I want. For negative reinforcement, some of the rats were put inside the box and there was an electrical current. In order to turn that off, the rats would have to bump against the lever. Once they figured that out, they were able to take away that the undesired electrical current, but the desired behavior is still the rat pushing the lever. And through that negative reinforcement, removing the stimulus to avoid consequences, they were able to show the desired behavior of pressing the lever. Positive punishment would be decreasing behaviors by adding an undesired stimulus. So, an example of this could be if a child gets in a fight with their sibling, maybe they hit the sibling, the parent intervenes, and then the parent scolds the child for showing that undesired behavior. So, the undesired stimulus would be the parent scolding the child. So, they're adding something to decrease the behavior, which is why it would be a positive punishment. Negative punishment differs because it would still decrease the behaviors because it's punishment, but it would be removing a desired stimulus, which makes it negative. So maybe a child is fighting over a new toy with their sibling, the parent intervenes and then removes the new toy to decrease the behavior of fighting. So they would remove that desired stimulus in order to decrease the undesired behaviors. In all, operant conditioning can be useful for training dogs, disciplining children, and also encouraging students in school environments. So, I read this study in which it was highlighted that operant conditioning can be very influential and very useful for teachers in school settings. So, they gave different examples of positive punishment and negative reinforcement, positive reinforcement and negative punishment, in order to help the teachers better understand how to help these kids either decrease behaviors or increase behaviors. So, I'm just going to read the comparative case one. So the example for positive punishment is Miss Pustel teaches the class in mathematics to compensate for many interruptions and resulting missed time on task. She decides on the following. The class has to stay longer after each lesson. So because they won't focus in class, they want to decrease the behavior of the children not focusing, so they have to add extra time to stay in the lessons. That's that positive part of positive punishment. Then for the negative reinforcement example, Miss Mouse is the teacher for STEM. She regularly writes short tests in her lessons. Since the class is often unfocused, the students usually perform poorly. She gives the class the following option. If everyone works with concentration until the vacation, everyone's worst short test will be dropped and will not be considered for grading. So this is an example of negative reinforcement. So they are reinforcing being focused in class, by saying that you can avoid a bad test grade if you focus. So they are taking away something bad in order to reinforce good behavior in the classroom. You can, of course, read comparative case 4 in your own time. I did link the study on the last slide, but I just wanted to extend some examples for operant conditioning as it wasn't covered in the textbook. So, just a short review of materials. Classical conditioning is the involuntary learning, the unconscious learning in which there is a natural response to something, but then a neutral stimulus intervenes. It is now paired with the unconditioned stimulus, and then there is a conditioned stimulus that results from that neutral stimulus in order to create a new connection in the mind of the subject. And then operant conditioning is just learning from consequences. This is that voluntary learning, learning from circumstances, learning from outcomes of situations. Like I said, there's reinforcement and punishment, and then both positive and negative variations of each. But in all, that is my presentation. I hope you guys learned a little bit more about operant versus classical conditioning, and I hope the examples were of some help. Like I said, the studies that I used were linked in here. Some more information on both operant and classical conditioning is here as well. But thank you.